Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone attending the forum today in Mathematica's DC office, and a special welcome to those of you attending via webinar. Before we get started today, for those of you here in DC, please remember that there will be a networking reception immediately following the event right out here in our 12th floor lobby. As the director of Mathematica's Center for Improving Research Evidence, I'm really pleased that you could all join us for today's forum. I'd like to give you a little background on the Center for Improving Research Evidence, or CIRE. The center is uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between policy research and practice by offering expertise in designing and using an array of scientific research methods and approaches in diverse settings. Today we'll focus on how research findings, particularly those deemed statistically significant, are often used and occasionally misused to identify what works in public policy and programs. We'll emphasize how important it is for both the research, policy, and practice communities to have the clearest possible understanding of what statistical significance means, does not mean, and when it matters. Please do note that we're video recording today's session, and so we may capture images of some of you in the audience. The video will be posted to our website by the end of the week. And to help ensure the best possible sound quality for the recording and for the webinar audience, I would ask that you all please turn off your electronic devices. Now with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Alan Schirm, to the podium. Alan recently retired from nearly 30 years of service here at Mathematica, including as Vice President and our Director of Research Methods. Alan will introduce our topic and our first speaker. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. Last year, the American Statistical Association issued a policy statement about the ongoing concern that p-values and statistical significance are often misunderstood and misused by researchers and decision makers. The statement highlighted the need for continued conversation among many interested parties, including policymakers and practitioners who rely on evidence to inform their programmatic and funding decisions. Today's forum will continue that conversation. At the start of the webinar, we launched a polling question to see how many of you have actually read the ASA statement. Our online audience has had the chance to respond, but if you haven't, please do so now. But how about you folks in the room? Could you please raise your hand if you've read the ASA statement? Okay, maybe fifth, a quarter, something like that. So what have we found for our online audience? Yeah, just about the same. You know, about a fifth. We'll be discussing that. But yeah, looks like fifth to a quarter have actually read the ASA statement. So Ryan, you're going to have some explaining to do. But what I'd like to do now is introduce our first speaker, who's Ron Wasserstein, the Executive Director of the American Statistical Association. Ron will discuss the content and context of the ASA statement. After his presentation and introductions of our other panelists, our experts will answer questions, first from me and then from all of you, our in-house and webinar audiences. And with that, I'll yield the floor to Ron.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon to those of you here and to all the ships at sea. So if you're a parent, then you know what the talk is. And about 3 years ago, my wife and I proudly brought home two 10-year-old boys from Haiti. And a few months later, I was sitting downstairs comfortably watching a Nats game, and my wife brought the boys downstairs and said they needed the talk. She seemed to have a little bit of glee in her eyes about that. The talk is complicated enough, but when you're talking to two boys who are just learning English, it's an extra challenge. And I came to realize that explaining p-values to non-statisticians is just like having the talk. They think they already know all about it already because they've learned about it from their peers. It's not nearly as interesting as they thought it would be. They've stopped listening before I stopped talking. And chances are they now understand it even less than when I began. Before getting into the particulars of the ASA statement on p-values and statistical significance, I'd like to say a few words about why we did this, because it was out of our comfort zone. It hasn't been the culture of the ASA to make declarations like this one. We've made statements typically about kind of narrow aspects of statistics, like a few years ago, a statement about how to use statistics to audit elections, for example. But inference is at the very heart of statistics, and it's been the tradition of our community, and really, of science in general, that you work those things out in the journals and in the arena of practice, and you don't need to issue a statement about this, but this just wasn't working when it came to this matter. So here's a quote. It's been widely felt, probably for 30 years or more, that significance tests are overemphasized and often misused, and that more emphasis should be put on estimation and prediction. And this was said by the estimable D.R. Cox in 1986. And that he was talking about 30 years prior to that. So the problem has been well identified and widely acknowledged for a long time, and yet it's not improving. There's a whole bunch of quotes about this that you can find at David Parkhurst's website. So these are words from the introduction to the ASA statement on p-values. And we recognize that the problems with use and interpretation have been around for a long time, and yet the problems persist, and so it seems like this statement resonates. It's been downloaded over 170,000 times, and in less than a year already has 300 citations. Now, as a statistician, I have to compare 170,000 with something, so Taylor Swift's Shake It Off has been viewed over 1.5 billion times. John Oliver did a wonderful show on reproducibility that was watched 5 million times the first week. And if you haven't seen it, it's fabulous. So, okay, doesn't compare well to those, but compared to a typical statistics paper, 170,000 is really good. It was equal to, sort of all the downloads of everything in that journal for the previous year. So why did we do this? Well, we were spurred on by attacks on p-values that morphed into attacks on statistics. So here's an article in Science News. Odds are it's wrong, and might be hard for you to see the subtitle, so I'll blow it up there. Science fails to face the shortcomings of statistics. So all of a sudden, problems with p-values are being blamed on, or suggested that they're, sort of problems with the whole infrastructure of statistics. And then a journal went as far as to ban a p-value, and Science News viewed this as a giant leap for science. So in this environment, we thought that a statement by the world's largest community of statisticians might have a beneficial impact on the conduct of science with respect to statistics. So in the beginning of the statement, you see that we set out to clarify what a p-value is. Informally, it's the probability under a specified statistical model that a statistical summary of the data, maybe something like mean difference between two groups, would be equal to or more extreme than its observed value. And so that's an informal statement, and 538 said that the definition was about as clear as mud. Okay? You can get more formal. In one of the addendums to the statement, Philip Stark wrote the simplest general definition. I'll just let you admire that for a bit. And for those of you who are into measurability and so on, good on ya. What goes into a p-value? Well, one of the things that experts that work on the ASA statement were adamant about is that the p-value isn't just conditioned on the null hypothesis. If you've learned anything about a p-value anywhere, it's that it's based on the assumption that the null hypothesis is true, but it turns out that it's also based on everything else that goes into the statistical model. And we could argue, and lots of people do, about what constitutes the model and what doesn't and so on, but I think the takeaway message for you on this should be that correctly interpreting the p-value depends not only on the assumptions made in calculating the p-value, but on all the factors that led to its calculation. So think of it this way. If you were given the raw data, what is everything that you would need to know in order to be able to produce that same test statistic and p-value that the researchers did? And everything that you need to know to do that is part of interpreting what that p-value is. And so, you know, did we group some data together? Did we eliminate some outliers? What kinds of, all those kinds of choices that get made affect the p-value. So the ASA statement articulates 6 principles. The first one gives kind of a measured view of what a p-value can do. The second one tells you what it doesn't do, but it's often accused of doing. Okay, it doesn't measure the probability that the studied hypothesis is true. It's not the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. For me, the third one is the most important, and I think it's the most important to you. We said that we shouldn't be basing decisions only on whether the p-value passes a specific threshold. The fourth is important for all kinds of just good practice reasons. You need to be transparent and report in full, or you don't really understand what the p-value is telling us. The fifth is basically another warning about interpretation. And finally, the sixth one is kind of a bit more technical, but along with the third principle, it argues for taking a lot of care in making p-value based decisions. So a lot of people have asked me, do I think the p-value statement or the ASA statement, did it go far enough? What do I think about that? Well, it doesn't go quite as far as this signpost goes, but even though it doesn't go as far as it could go, let me just say candidly, it didn't go as far as it should, but went as far as it could. Okay, this was the level of agreement that we could reach among a lot of experts because the issues underlying it are complex and they get people excited when they start talking about them. So the biggest shortcoming of the statement is that it doesn't spell out very clearly what the alternatives are, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But many people have written to say that that we left them hanging in this, and that's a fair criticism. One concern that everybody involved with the p-value statement had was that people would just sort of throw out the p-value statement and substitute the p-value, and substitute something else. So, okay, ASA says p-value is not good, 0.05 not good. So let's just say if my Bayes factor exceeds 6.87, bingo. Okay, well, just throwing out one number summary and inserting another one number summary is not what we have in mind. The statement developers don't think that we should be able to expect that something as complicated as inference can just be boiled down to one number. So I would say that the biggest takeaway message from the p-value statement is that bright line thinking is bad for science, and Ken Rothman pulled no punches in writing a supplemental article for the statement. He said, scientists have embraced and even avidly pursued meaningless differences solely because they are statistically significant, and have ignored important effects because they failed to pass the screen of statistical significance. It is a safe bet, Ken says, that people have suffered or died because scientists and editors, regulators, journalists, and others have used significance tests to interpret results and have consequently failed to identify the most beneficial courses of action. That's pretty serious. Now, you may think that I'm pushing the point a little bit about bright line thinking, that surely this, it's less than 0.05, it's greater than 0.05 thing is really not that big of a deal. So what I'm going to show you here, thanks to a colleague, Matthew Hankins, I'll cite him a little bit later, is actual bits from research articles where people have arrived at a certain p-value. So all of these statements here are going to be about p-values around 0.06, okay? A little bit bigger than 0.05. Almost significant, almost attained significance, almost significant tendency, almost became significant, almost but not quite significant, almost statistically significant, almost reached statistical significance, just barely below the level of significance, just beyond significance. And I love this quote, "Surely God loves the 0.06 nearly as much as the 0.05. And the authors, Rosnell and Rosenthal, go on to say in their 1989 article, "Can there be any doubt that God views the strength of evidence for or against the null as a fairly continuous function of the magnitude of p?" So you can see how people here are, sort of desperately trying to row themselves closer to the 0.05 shore, right? Well, what if you got left out a little farther in the water? Okay, so your p-value was 0.08. Well, then you have to think about this differently. You have to think in terms of trends, okay? A certain trend towards significance. And I'm a big fan of one-numbered trends, okay? A definite trend, a slight tendency towards significance, a strong trend towards significance, a trend close to significance, an expected trend, approached our criteria of significance, approaching borderline significance. Borderline significance sounds like a condition more than anything else, right? Approaching, although not reaching significance. And you've really got a big problem if you got really close to 0.05 but didn't get there. Then you need to really use the English language powerfully. Hovered at a nearly significant level. Hovers on the brink of significance, just about significant, which, think that one through a little bit. It's not significant, but it's just about. Just above the margin of significance, just at the conventional level of significance, just barely statistically significant. We're going to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, why not? Just borderline significant, there that condition is again. Just escaped significance. Doggone it, we had it, and it got loose. Just failed significance. So again, thanks to Matthew Hankins for these quotes. The fundamental problem is that for most of us, really, the p-value isn't conditioned on what we'd like to be, what we'd like it to be. So we generally want to know what is the probability that our hypothesis is true given what we've seen, given the data that we have. But p-values tell you, in effect, the probability that you got the data that you got given that some null hypothesis is true. And, of course, as I've already mentioned, everything else that goes into computing the thing. And these two things look a lot alike, but they are not the same. And here is a wonderful example that Ron Carver provided us nearly 40 years ago. He asks, what is the probability of obtaining a dead person, D, given that the person was hanged? Okay, so symbolically, it's the same, looks the same, probability of D given H, and he just makes up a number. Let's say that it's 0.97, okay? Now, flip that around. What's the probability that a person has been hanged, given that they're dead? Okay, well, that's going to be a lot lower, and we'll just make up a number that, say, 0.01, okay? No one, Carver says, would be likely to make the mistake of substituting the first estimate, 0.97, for the second one, 0.01, that is to accept as 0.97 as the probability that the person has been hanged, given that the person is dead. And yet, Carver says, even though this seems like it would be an unlikely mistake for someone to make, it's exactly the kind of mistake that's made in the interpretation of statistical significance testing. I think the problem or a big problem anyway, is that inference is just hard. It's hard work to take what we know so far, to gather more information, and from that to try to move forward with knowledge and do that right. And one way that's commonly been made to used to make inference easier, while giving the appearance of objectivity, is to specify some calculations and some procedures and to set thresholds that make something statistically significant. And that seems all very objective because either the number is significant or it's not. And it's ironic that Bayesian methods are often criticized for being subjective, and yet there's a whole lot of subjectivity that's actually lying underneath some of these frequentist calculations. And so this group that worked on the ASA statement would really like to see us move beyond that. So in a world where a p-value less than 0.05 carried no meaning at all, what would you have to do to get your paper published, your research grant funded, your drug approved, or your policy or business recommendation accepted? And I argue that you'd have to sell it. You'd have to be convincing. You'd make good arguments for your position based on the nature of your study or the nature of your design, based on what you've already know about the topic, what's known, what's been conjectured. You'd use all the statistical results that you had at hand, not just boil it all down to a p-value. And I think that people really want to do that. I think they want to be able to look at the whole picture and make an argument for why they make the claim that they make, and don't want to be held in this box that requires them to somehow make it so they get to p less than 0.05. You'd also have to be transparent, because all those little decisions that you make in analyzing your data have an impact on the p-value. And in the best case scenario, if you're not transparent about those things, then you can unintentionally mislead people, because the choices you made led to one thing, and other choices would lead to something else. And of course, there's the opportunity there to intentionally mislead as well. So let me wrap up here. P-values themselves are not the problem. That's not what the ASA statement says. But they are hard to explain. Okay, you try to talk to somebody about them, and I taught for many years and just felt like I was twisting myself into the ground trying to explain this. They are easy to misunderstand. They don't directly address the question of interest. And when mixed with bright line thinking, they lead to bad science. And I have a fifth point here that I added just for Alan, because he's had to listen to me talk about this before. So maybe if you've only been dating p-values, only seeing p-values, you should start seeing some other statistics, okay? Time to date around a little bit. So the ASA does plan to go further than the statement. We know it didn't go as far as it needed to. And so this October, just a few miles from here, we're going to gather researchers, policymakers, and others to talk about conducting research, using research, sponsoring, disseminating, reproducing, and replicating research in the 21st century. We will be really focusing on the alternatives. Alan is helping us plan that, and he's helped us to have our focus be, whereas the statement sort of talks about what not to do, we'll move in this symposium to talk about what to do. And I hope that this will be something of interest to you, and maybe that you'll want to drop by here in a few months. So let me conclude with this haiku, a little p-value. What are you trying to say of significance? From my friend Steve Ziliak at Roosevelt University. I want to thank Brad Carlin for letting me use the title of this talk, and I want to thank you for the opportunity and privilege to speak to you this afternoon.
Well, with two daughters in their early 20s, I don't know what I think of dating around, but thanks for a terrific presentation, Ron. Really, really excellent. You talked a lot about misinterpretation of p-values and statistical significance. Although it's common, how many of us here have seen it happen. Let's launch a second polling question. Have you personally witnessed a misinterpretation of a p-value or a significance test? Yes, no, or can't remember. While we're waiting for the webinar audience to respond, let's see a show of hands for the folks here in the room if you have witnessed such a misinterpretation. Okay, got to keep them up. It's, yeah, probably half, 2/3, maybe even 3/4. So more of you than have read the ASA statement. Well, what about our webinar audience? Let's see how they respond. Okay, so just over 60%, with about a quarter not being able to remember. But, you know, it's clearly prevalent. I mean, the sort of misinterpretations that Ron has been discussing. Now, before getting into some specific questions about those misinterpretations, what we do about them, and other issues, let's have each of the panelists take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. I don't know, should we just go down the row? Molly, Stuart, Tim?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Molly Irwin. I'm the Chief Evaluation Officer at the Department of Labor. And what my office does is oversees and coordinates the evaluation activities that happen across the department. So we work with the agencies and program offices in the Department of Labor to think through their research questions, their learning agendas, and based on those and the direction of agency and department leadership, congressional mandates, we develop the evaluation plan for the department. And then our office oversees the implementation of that plan. Most of the evaluations, the overwhelming majority of evaluations, are done through research grants and research contracts that are procured in a competitive process and are carried out by independent external researchers. So we play a role both in thinking through what are the research questions, and then on the back end of taking the research findings and working with the program offices and policymakers to think through the implications of those findings and what the programmatic policy and research direction is based on those. So we spend a lot of time both working with researchers to design studies that are meaningful and then trying to help interpret the results in the end. So have a lot of conversations about what does this mean, does this thing work, all tying, I think, into the conversation that we're having today.
So I'm Stuart Buck. I'm Vice President of Research at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. And so our foundation funds a lot of public policy related research, a lot of kind of economics, education, criminal justice, and health policy research. But the thing that I'm interested in is trying to promote reproducibility and transparency in the scientific process, including social science and medicine. And so I'm most interested in this topic because I think that the kind of dichotomy between P of 0.049 and P of 0.051 can encourage behavior is known as p-hacking sometimes. So messing around with your data and your statistical models and specifications in order to try to get the best possible p-value so as to maximize the chance of publication and what's seen as a positive result. And I think that can undermine the validity and the reproducibility of the results that you're seeing. And so one of the projects that we sponsored that was covered a lot in the news about a 1.5 years ago was a reproducibility project in psychology. So when replicated 100 psychology experiments that had been published in top journals, they found that about 40% of the time they could be replicated successfully. So indicating that there's probably a lot of publication bias going on in the original studies that you might see in a given literature. And when you're only seeing the positive results, the ones where the p-value is under 0.05, the actual positive predictive value of what you're seeing throughout a literature does not mean that 95% of those results are true. So I think that's kind of sobering, and I think those kinds of results would probably be found in a lot of other areas of literature as well.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tim Day, and I'm a health services researcher at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Innovation Center. And our center is tasked with finding new ways to pay for and deliver healthcare for our beneficiaries that both improve quality while also reducing healthcare expenditures. And so in doing this work, we do these large-scale model tests and independently evaluate those. As with Molly, we do a lot of contract research to do that. And so my colleagues and I end up with a lot of findings that are very complex, very nuanced, which we then have the task of boiling down into a one-pager or a couple slides for our policymakers and trying to tell the story without losing the nuance and the context. And so we've given a lot of thought to how to present results, in what ways we're relying on the p-value, and hoping to bring some of that experience to bear to the conversation today.
Very good. Thanks, Molly, Stuart, Tim. Now it's time for questions and answers. I'll ask some questions, and after about 20-25 minutes, we'll open up the session to our audience, both in the room and via webinar. For our webinar audience, you can start submitting questions using the Q&A widget right now, but please include your name and affiliation and try to be as succinct as possible. So for our first question to our panel, I want to get to the issue of misinterpretation and the need for evidence to drive decision-making. Ron gave us a few of the many examples in which presumably trained researchers have misinterpreted p-values and statistical significance. The charitable take on those misinterpretations is that the researchers are trying to be helpful and to make p-values more intuitive, but they probably end up misleading rather than helping their audience. From your experiences when the audiences consist of policymakers and program administrators, what would really be helpful? Do they understand p-values? What evidence do they want to guide their decision-making? For example, do they want to know about the probability of hypotheses given the data? P of H given D in Ron's notation.
I'm happy to take a stab at that. So we were actually curious about what our policymakers were understanding. We interviewed a set of executive-level policymakers, and one of the things we asked them was to sort of explain in their own words, what does it mean for a result to be statistically significant? And not surprisingly, only one of the 14 people we interviewed could give sort of a close to correct and accurate definition. And we heard a lot of the same sort of pitfalls that Ron highlighted, where they're trying to conflate the significance, statistical significance of a result with how policy relevant it is, or the probability that the hypothesis is true. So I think in our experience, we've certainly heard a desire to know probabilities, but they're sort of twisting the probabilities that we get out of p-values in ways that really I don't know that are completely accurate.
So a couple things. I mean, I think generally people don't understand p-values, and I think usually what they think they are hearing is whether or not the estimate is accurate. I think what they want to know is that what's the probability that this program works. And I think they want to know the practical significance. They want to know, is this a meaningful difference? And neither one of those things are told through the p-value. So while I agree that I think they really want to know more and want to think about this, I think they also want a bright line yes or no, an easy way to understand, does this thing work? And I think would be less comfortable with more, with less seeming certainty around that. So I think the answer is yes to both. Yes, they don't understand, but they want bright line thinking. So I think it's challenging.
My intuition is that people don't understand, even people that are supposed to understand by their profession. So you mentioned journalist Christy Ashwanden. So I met her about a year or so ago because she was at a conference that our foundation was sponsoring amongst academics at Stanford. And she grabbed a number of people, one of which is me, and then a bunch of others, a bunch of other experts, and said she was doing interviews about, it was just about the conference. And so she pulled people out one by one into the hall and said, okay, can I ask you some questions? Okay, sure. And so she starts the video playing and she says, can you explain, in terms of a layperson to understand, what a p-value is? And she has a great video on 538 where you see all these people suddenly looking shocked and kind of stammering and starting to giggle because they're not sure. And these are experts. I mean, these are people who teach at Stanford and other places like that. And even they are kind of stumped when trying to explain what a p-value is in terms that any normal person can understand. So yeah, I don't think most people understand p-values, and I think it's contrary to the intuition of what they really want to know. Because I think they do want to know what's the probability that this effect is true, or what's the probability of the hypothesis given the data. And instead they're being told conditional on an assumption that there is no effect, and conditional on a bunch of other assumptions about your statistical model, what's the probability of seeing data this extreme or more extreme? That doesn't make any sense to anybody, really, when you try to explain that. They want to know the probability of the hypothesis given the data. And so what you really need to do is take the p-value, probability of data given the hypothesis, and condition on the probability, the kind of prior probability of the hypothesis, and you end up with Bayes' theorem, right? So I would add a plug for what you said about kind of moving away from p-values and more towards Bayesian thinking.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, Tim, you mentioned, yeah, they like probabilities, and Stuart, you did too, but then they also want to know, well, does it work? I mean, how do we, is there a way to put those two together? I mean, in your experience, is it something like, well, is the probability that the effect is, at least exceeds some meaningful value 3/4? Or is that what they want to know? Or
I guess I think the one thing I would say is you can't paint with a broad brush. Each policymaker has different standards. There are going to be some that really want to see a p-value less than 0.05. That's what's going to convince them. But we've heard a variety of other things. One of which I found interesting was that the policymakers want to bring their own experience and expertise to bear on the question. So if they're looking at results from a model that has a lot of evidence in the literature, and it's more of a translational study, they might be more comfortable with, say, a 75% chance that it worked. Whereas if it's something totally radical that has never really been tested before, that may increase their sort of standard of evidence. But I think generally speaking, they're less comfortable with sort of an arbitrary, in their mind, standard of evidence at p less than 0.05 in a lot of cases.
Okay. Stuart, you touched upon alternative approaches, and that's what I wanted to ask about next. I mean, I think it's fair to say that social science policy research has been dominated by frequentist approaches to statistics, and in particular by significance testing of null hypotheses of no effect or no relationship. However, the essay statement calls for an end to reliance on bright line reasoning, such as significant, not significant. In your respective policy areas, have you started to see any progress in the use of alternative approaches? And if so, how are these alternatives being received? Are there, for example, concerns about reliance on the expert judgment of methodological and substantive experts?
So I can start. I mean, I think that there are certainly discussions in our office and in other federal research offices about other methods. I think I think that OPRE, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, and ACF does a methods conference every year and is thinking very much about having their next conference focus on Bayesian methods. So I think that there's certainly conversation about it. I think what we need to know from the researchers out there is what are the alternative methods and how can we use them to answer the questions that policymakers want to answer. I mean, I think that more and more in an environment of evidence-based policymaking, of tiered evidence initiatives where funding is explicitly tied to having grant proposals demonstrate that their approach is evidence-based, there has to be an objective way that folks can review those grant proposals and determine whether or not the approach is evidence-based. So I think that we've got to really think through what the alternative is and how something can be applied in an objective way to meet these real needs that folks have, and especially when real dollars are associated with the decisions that we're making.
I know Ron warned of the danger of drawing conclusions about a trend from one data point, but perhaps two data points. So I know two researchers who are grantees, Raj Chetty at Stanford and Amy Finkelstein at MIT, both of whom do a lot of very prominent research around social and policy and health policy. And I know they're both interested in moving some of their research more towards Bayesian hierarchical methods and the advantages that brings and being able to draw inferences. And so if people on that level are thinking about it, then I hope that is emblematic of something broader.
Yeah, and certainly at the Innovation Center, we've dipped our toe into the Bayesian waters. And I've started to explore that. I think it's a learning process for policymakers, and you have to really walk them through it to make them understand what you're showing them versus what they would see before. And in a lot of the ways we see it as a complement to traditional methods, so it's not like we're throwing out p-values, but it's allowing us to show, in addition to what the p-value is, what is the posterior distribution of effects. And I think it's an ongoing process, and something that we really have to convince them that including well-reasoned priors isn't going to bias our results. And in a lot of ways, I think there's ways to make your Bayesian assumptions even more transparent than some of the modeling assumptions you might make in a traditional method.
Well, and to me, whether it's an alternate method or p-values, a lot of the key here is transparency. I mean, going back to number 4 on the ACA principles, I mean, what I want to think about is how do we make the work, what can our office do to help encourage the transparency of the research that's going on? And we do a number of things now. We actually have an evaluation policy. Transparency is one of the core principles in that policy, and do a lot of work now to really think about how do we encourage having analysis plans, requiring analysis plans before anyone touches the data. Should we be encouraging pre-specification of studies? How do we make sure, what can we do to make sure that research that is done clearly lays out exactly what it's doing so we don't have an issue with p-hacking? And I think those are issues that we need to be thinking about in whatever approach we're using to make sure that whether it be a p-value or something else, that one has all of the information they need to determine how credible, how rigorous the research is, and to determine how they'll use that p-value, or if they think that p-value is meaningful to them.
Tim, I just wanted to ask you your experience when Bayesian methods are used. Do you feel that the decision makers, react to the findings that, yeah, this is the kind of thing I want to know. This is responsive to what I need, or are they still trying to figure it out? Or
no, I think we've gotten good response. Policymakers like bright colors, so we've been able to produce sort of red, yellow, green on the posterior distribution to say, there's a high likelihood in this area that the program is successfully saving money. If you're sort of falling in this yellow area, it's sort of a little less sure. The red area means, yeah, you're probably losing money. So I think we've gotten some good responses. Like I said, I don't know that it'll meet everyone's needs, and I don't know that we should be looking for a method that's a one-size-fits-all. But certainly, I think good response thus far.
bright colors are fine, just so there are no bright lines.
Yeah, right.
So most of what we've been talking about in the role of p-values and statistical significance is in analysis and inference. But it can also play a prominent role in guiding sample design. At one extreme, our analyses are just badly underpowered, sometimes because an agency can't afford a larger sample. At the other extreme are big data analyses in which samples are so large that substantively meaningless differences are still statistically significant. Then in between are evaluations, including RCTs, in which considerations of significance and power have played prominent roles in designing samples that are large enough to detect meaningful effects that are policy relevant. But are such studies being driven by something, the testing of statistical significance, that should be de-emphasized or not done at all? Or should conventional power analyses be continued? Or should we find a new approach?
I can maybe take a stab at this. We looked into whether there's sort of an alternative, easy to calculate power calculation for Bayesian methods, and the short answer seemed to be no, though if folks out in the audience have thoughts, please let me know. But I think in our world where we're thinking of it as a complement, it still makes sense to start with a traditional power analysis, understanding that in a lot of cases, by going to the Bayesian methods, we actually achieve some shrinkage and get more precise estimates. So we know, so long as we're well-powered under traditional analyses, we're almost certainly well-powered on the Bayesian side.
So I would just add to that. I mean, I think the process of thinking through carefully up front, what do we know already? What effect size do we expect to get? How big of a sample do we need to get that is really important. I think introducing or making sure that questions also about what would a meaningful effect size be are important and not always included. I mean, oftentimes when we're doing power analysis, we are just trying to make sure we get to 0.05 and not really thinking about what do we really need to see here? How big of an effect do we need to see to really make a difference, and then powering it that way. So I think there are more questions we should think about, but I do think the process of thinking carefully up front through these questions is really important. And yeah.
Yeah. So I think more power is all better. Is all for the better, all else being equal. I think underpowered studies are just a plague on humanity. That they are so. I mean, they give you the worst of all worlds. So John Ioannidis, another grantee, wrote an article explaining why with underpowered studies you have more sampling variability, and you combine that with publication bias. That means that you're going to miss a lot of effects that are true because they're underpowered, but also when you do, because of sampling variability, you see a particularly large effect that turns out to be significant, that probably also is untrue, and yet it's going to be the one that gets published. And so you have a completely biased literature when it's underpowered. And so there are whole areas of science, like neuroscience, where some of the one survey of the literature found the average level of power was something like 20%. So that's just terrible. Like that's a massive bias throughout the whole literature. So whatever method of statistical significance you're using, whether it's a bright line or not, I think probably more power is, or just larger samples is better, because you're going to get more precision about whatever it is you're trying to do.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, what we're balancing in the size of our models is if we spend a certain amount to fund, say, 100,000 bennies in one study, that's 100,000 bennies that can't be in another study. So I do think we need to be a little bit circumspect, but certainly erring on the side of more power is probably better.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to imply that power is the only consideration to the exclusion of all else. I just think that, and when you do power sufficiently or in sufficiently large samples, like any estimate is going to be significant, even of an effect, no matter how trivial. Because no effect is ever going to be precisely zero, right? The probability of any one specific point is itself zero. So like there'll always be an effect, even if it's 0.000001. And so if you have a big enough sample, like that, even that effect will be significant. So that you don't want to get into the business of especially with the weight we put on statistical significance today, you don't want to be discussing a bunch of just trivial effects and declaring those as if there's some sort of meaningful impact. But even so, I think in general, it's probably better to try to get larger sample sizes. Again, you have to consider budget and other things like that. But areas where there's 20% power, that's probably pretty bad. Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and I think we're going to talk about some of the research clearinghouses later. But I will say, I think that there are many times that having an underpowered study in research clearinghouses, when we're doing a review and trying to find what programs work, that if we have a null finding, for all practical purposes, that's seen as it doesn't work. So in those cases, if we're investing in a study, we want to invest in a study that is powered to provide an answer. And so I think that that's a different issue than the publication bias academic issue. When policymakers are trying to identify what works, they are often looking in research clearinghouses and finding those programs with a green check by them. And to get that green check, you have to have a study that's powered to detect something.
Well, I think that also goes to what your significance level is and how you try to balance type 1 and type 2 error. And,
absolutely.
In healthcare, we've got a system that everyone would agree is not functionally optimally. And so our policymakers are very concerned that we might throw out a program that is better than what we currently have just because we couldn't reject the null. So yeah, I think that's definitely true.
So my notes say Stuart always wants more power. I just wanted you to know how I wrote that down. But
I thought it was the Arnold Foundation will pay for more sample.
But I think what you were saying, Stuart, about publication bias and it leads to grant selection bias and all kinds of other things too is extremely important. And somebody shared with me a real simple way to think about this that's also horrifying. They said, imagine 100 studies of something that has actually there's no effect. Okay, so in 100 studies, and you have a type 1 error rate you accept of 5%. So 5 of those studies, presumably on average, would show a significant result, and those are the 5 that get published. And so you have a 100% error rate in terms of what actually gets published.
And that's, I mean, that's almost the best case scenario. I mean, given the assumption that all the effects are false, I mean, you're not even allowing for the flexibility in analysis and model specification that can also occur. So it could be, yeah, you could see 20 studies out of the 100 get published, and yeah.
Well, this has been great, and I have more questions, but let's take some questions from the audience. For the webinar participants, remind you to submit questions electronically through the Q&A panel. For everybody else, both webinar and in person, please be sure to state your name and affiliation and try to be as succinct as possible so we can get in as many questions as we can. For the folks here in the room, there is a microphone that you need to use so that it's picked up in the recording. So why don't I start here in the room? Any questions? One right here.
Thanks. This is Helen from Mathematica. So you've mentioned several times about moving towards Bayesian statistics, which as a statistician, I think is great. You know, there's lots of approaches out there for doing things. But my worry would be that if there's a big push to move away from frequentist and go to Bayesian, will we not be sitting down here in a couple of years' time having the same discussion? Something will not be right there. So if the problem is that people don't understand p-values and that they are misusing them, is the fear not that if you just switch that out for something else and we go Bayesian, we'll just have this discussion in a different context?
So, yep, that's exactly,
Well, yes.
that's a legitimate concern. And that's why one of the things that was said in the ASA statement is that we don't expect that there should be a single index, a single number that's going to be able to just answer all the questions. And we've spoken about p-values being misunderstood, but I think all of you can relate to the idea that uncertainty is misunderstood. So when you're having to make decisions, and it doesn't matter whether you have 3 colors or 30 on there, at the end of the day a decision is made and you don't know whether it was the right decision at the time that it was made. And that has become sort of natural for us to understand and is generally not very well appreciated by anyone else. We're supposed to be able to provide the answer.
Yeah, hopefully, you know, with the symposium that ASA is sponsoring next fall, and with conversations like this, there are opportunities for everybody to kind of step back, you know, understand what's happening, you know, what the problems are, and then, you know, reflect on, okay, well, what do we need to do? And then, you know, sort of a reset, you know, and move forward. But yes, the risks remain. But, you know, at least maybe now they're in the context of, you know, the experiences we've been having for at least the last 60 years. And, you know, we haven't made a lot of progress, but at least maybe if we start moving on, you know, understanding the problem better and having explicit conversations about that, you know, there will be the opportunity to, you know, move forward with that knowledge. So.
And I would add, I mean, of course, any method can be misapplied, misunderstood, misused. And so, yes, we probably would be back. But I think that, to me, kind of ironically, one of the pitfalls of p-values is that people who try to comprehend p-values think that they're looking at what Bayesian analysis would be telling them. So they think they're getting a probability that the hypothesis is true given the data. So they see a p-value 0.05 and they think erroneously that means a 95% chance that this effect is true. And if they instead got a statistic that was trying to tell them the probability that the hypothesis is true, and that made explicit what are your assumptions about the prior, you know, what you have a really, you know, very precise prior, or, you know, uniform prior, then I think that it would eliminate at least that misunderstanding, right? So,
at an APAM session on this topic, Naomi Goldstein offered up a quote that has been attributed to Albert Einstein. Not sure if it's really from him, but in any case, it was, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not one bit simpler. So, should we take a question from the webinar audience?
Yes, we have a question coming from Carrie Kettler from the Actuarial Research Corporation. And she asks, coming from a non-statistician, she's an actuary, are there defenders of the p-value? Does the panel think that there are good and or appropriate uses of p-values, or is it a concept that may become obsolete?
Ryan, I mean, you were in all the discussions leading up to the ASA statement. Do you want to?
There wouldn't be agreement in the statistical community that p-values are obsolete. They should be completely thrown out. But that great caution has to be used in using them. And why not use the p-value appropriately, understand what its limitations are, interpret it with care, and also look at other methods, Bayesian methods, decision theory methods, whatever, information theory methods, all these things are things that I'm not very familiar with, but there are approaches that are out there that provide different ways of evaluating the strength of evidence that you have.
I mean, yeah, I can't remember if it was in one of the comments on the ASA statement, but I think it was. Somebody said, a p-value is really a bad answer to the wrong question. But there's certainly not unanimous agreement, maybe not even majority agreement with that. But in any case, I think the points Ron was emphasizing of reducing it down to the sole piece of evidence that's considered, and then making a bright line decision. That I think there's much broader agreement that's a very serious problem. And frankly, some of what's done is just simply wrong. But even if it's right, it's still not necessarily good practice. So, for one of you here in the room. Okay.
Hi, I'm Stu Gutterman, and I'm almost 95% confident that I'm retired. But I used to work at CMS, and I ran what was then the Office of Research, Development, and Information. And what concerns me, I think the use of p-values is fine if they're used appropriately and if the right questions are asked. And we tend in evaluations to ask the wrong question, such as, does this work? So I think it's more important, and I think anything that's done, Bayesian methods, I'm not that familiar with them, but if they can provide more information, that's great. But I think we want to avoid separating the importance of the model that's used to arrive at the results and the context in which that model is developed. For instance, in healthcare, there's so many things changing that I worry that CMMI is going to have trouble establishing the distinct effect of any one of the many innovations that they're putting out there. And there's going to be the tendency to say, well, okay, we saved $2 trillion in healthcare. Well, $2 trillion, healthcare spending is $2 trillion less than it was projected to be before we started doing these things, but nothing works. So this $2 trillion in savings came from random occurrences, which I don't believe they did. And perhaps they came from the fact that all of these innovations are. So I'd like to make sure that you have, that this is part of a triad, that the statistical methods are combined with the importance of the modeling and the policy context that's being considered.
If I could jump in. Yeah, no, I think I couldn't agree more. I think the way I tend to think of it is the analysis is like the very last step, right? And we have the advantage in the Innovation Center to be able to set up our model tests. So we can make them randomized if that's possible. We can do other things that can hopefully help us get an unbiased comparison group, an unbiased control group. And so, yeah, I definitely agree that whichever method you use doesn't change whether you have all the pieces in place ahead of that.
we take a webinar question?
Yes, we have another question from the webinar from Frank Yoon with the IBM Watson Health. The question is to all panelists: how has the volume and pace of innovation and research, one, changed over time in your policy domain, and two, influenced your thinking about the role of p-values in policy evaluation?
Let me ask Watson.
Did you want me to repeat? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, one more time. To all the panelists, how has the volume and pace of innovation and research, one, changed over time in your policy domain, and two, influenced your thinking about the role of p-values in policy evaluation?
Healthcare, I think Stu already hit the nail on the head that we have so many things going on at once, so we certainly need to be careful of inappropriately sort of calling things failures when in fact other things were going on in the comparison group perhaps that made them not look as successful.
So this may not be a direct question, but I mean, I think in social science research and policy research, there has been over time, over the last 15 years, more and more conversation about and demand for evidence-based policymaking. And I think we're seeing it more and more in legislation. I think we're seeing it in a lot of places where in tiered funding initiatives and legislation, where the policymakers are saying you need to demonstrate that this strategy is evidence-based. And so we are then we're really thinking through how do we do this? We're doing more and more evaluations. There are evidence clearinghouses now that are being funded by many of the federal agencies that are really trying to take the studies that are being published and look at how rigorous the design is, give a rating to the extent to which, based on the design, one can be confident that the findings are a result of the program. So it's looking at whether or not the design was an RCT and whether there was baseline equivalence and those kind of things. And then in addition, these clearinghouses try and say something about, given all of these studies of this particular program or model, what have we learned in terms of effects? Is this an effective model? And so in many cases, there are many studies of a particular model, and we can look across studies, and that's helpful. But still, in the criteria, and if you look at What Works Clearinghouse, if you look at the Department of Labor's Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research, if you look at, there's a whole number of these, when you look at the criteria for evidence of effectiveness, it is based on whether or not the program had, they're different from clearinghouse to clearinghouse, but one or more statistically significant positive finding in this area. And based on that, they're rated effective or not. So I think, and all of this stems from a need to be able to answer this question, which is not always the right question, about what works. And I think what for us would be really helpful is, as we are thinking through whatever method it is, using p-values or frequentist approaches or alternate methods, how we can think through the criteria by which we are looking at studies and making and being able to say in an objective and very transparent way how credible the study is and what we know about the effectiveness of the intervention that's being studied. Because there are important questions that are being asked by Congress in some cases in legislation, so we need a way to do that. And that's where the push over time for, I think in many cases, in many federal research offices, is coming from. So, and it makes it harder then to rely on expert judgment and a less clear line thinking, because we want to be able to be very clear and very transparent, because there's real funding decisions associated with what comes out in these ratings.
I might just say one more thing with regards to Frank's very good question. I'm not in policy, so I'm just approaching this from sort of the general standpoint. Massive amounts of data have made all kinds of interesting things possible, and we're able to do a lot of prediction of some very practical kinds of things. But so certain things that you can predict effectively you don't have to really know why they work. It's not super important to know whether having cereal on the third shelf versus the second shelf makes a difference, as long as you know from all this data that you have from your shoppers that it does make a difference. And if you put it there, it matters somehow. But for the decisions that you have to make, really be helpful to understand what the mechanism is. And that is not necessarily any easier to do, even with a large volume of data.
Take another question here in the room. Duncan.
Duncan Chaplin here at Mathematica. Maybe you said this and I missed it, but I'm wondering, is one solution just to say, well, we should stop asking if things work and only ask how well they work? So sort of, obviously if we had huge sample sizes, then we'd always get everything would be statistically significant, or we sort of can assume that, and just stop asking the question, does it work, and just focus on how well does it work? What's the point estimate?
Are you going?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think you make the good point that emphasizing the effect size makes a lot of sense. Especially, I think, as Molly was saying, if we can pin people down to give us what they hypothesize the effect size will be, that gives us a good way to try and judge some of these effects. And so, yeah, I fully support, I think, making that a point of emphasis, because it's ultimately what we're trying to measure. How much did the program save, or what amount did quality go up or down, and not just in an absolute sense, yes or no, do we think it went down or do we think it went up?
And one of the things that we have thought about and would like help thinking about is what can we do to have something about effect size in these evidence reviews. And it's really, that's really tricky. The information often isn't there in studies. It would be very hard, I think, to do it. But that is another place that I think, as there are more evidence reviews and as we are in a position, hopefully, to push the field forward, because folks want their studies in the reviews and want the studies to be reviewed well, if there are ways that we can push researchers forward to make sure that there is information in reports of findings that would allow the calculation of an effect size so that it could go into these reviews and be meaningful looking across many studies, I think that would be that would be a good direction to go. But right now, at least, given the information that we have in most studies, that's really hard to do.
And I would agree with your sentiment that we need to move away from this dichotomous thinking of, thumbs up, thumbs down, does it work, does it not? Also, p-value of 0.05 or not. I mean, I think that kind of thinking, misses the fact that the evidence is on a continuum. For programs, programs might work in some places, but not others. For any number of factors, they might work for some people, not others. Maybe you need to be looking at what's happening across the distribution and not just the overall mean effect. So yeah, I think that, as much as it warms my heart that to see Congress writing in legislation that we need to be funding what works and looking for conventional standards of statistical significance, which I recall being in some legislation. It's kind of touching in a way that they care about that, but I don't want Congress mandating that any more than they should mandate like fixed effects over random effects, or like the Bonferroni correction instead of Benjamini-Hochberg. Like, it's just not really their expertise, and they're kind of making rigid this process that really ought to be more informed by the latest thinking from statistics.
In most cases, at least in legislation, it doesn't tell us how to define effective. It just says, for example, 75% of this $1.5 billion needs to go to grantees that propose effective evidence-based strategies. So then it falls to us, the large us sitting in this room and beyond, to think through, okay, what does that mean, and how do we determine that in an objective way so that we can distribute this huge amount of money in an objective and transparent way. So that's where, whether it be frequentist approaches and p-values or something else, what we need to really think through are, what are those criteria and how do we apply them?
Yeah, the ASA statement certainly speaks to statistics and moving from dichotomous evidence, significant, not significant, to a more continuous view of evidence, and looking, it specifically talks about effect sizes and the precision of those estimates and so forth. But it does also speak to higher level scientific inference and broader decision making. And I think sometimes we kind of oversimplify that decision making, and that yes, an agency, Congress, may need to make a decision. Yes, we fund it. No, we don't. But there's also a question of, well, how much do we fund it? And there are certainly tiered evidence programs that the stronger your evidence, the more funding you get. And I think moving in that direction to a more continuous view of inference and decision making may be a valuable thing to consider. Let's see, are we due for a webinar question?
Yes.
We switched it because the previous one was no longer relevant.
Oh.
The next one down?
Yeah.
Okay. So this question comes from Jack Hasiak, an independent consultant. His question is, do you have recommendations for policymakers avoiding the policymaker error using research results misrepresentative of the larger study landscape?
So I'm not sure if this is getting exactly at Jack's question, but I've been taught that maybe the 5 words that should strike fear in your heart if you hear them in the news is, in a groundbreaking new study. And I think Tim addressed this in a remark earlier, that research should be held to a higher standard when it's brought forth as being, sort of wildly different or contradictory from everything else that's been known up to that point. And if that's done in some way, then it probably keeps us from, having, caffeine being bad for us today and good for us tomorrow and bad for us the next day. And I can't remember if it was John Oliver or Stephen Colbert that said that in a groundbreaking new study, we've learned that most studies are not groundbreaking.
Yeah. Okay. Question from here.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a statistician at Mathematica. So my question is, do you have any practical, concrete guidance for statisticians and researchers, like something we can do and we can change starting tomorrow, starting right now?
Sounds like that one's for you, Ron.
Oh. I was hoping to shrink back into the background. So I think the answer to that depends on the answer to where you're going to start tomorrow depends on what you've been doing today. If one has been excessively dependent on p-values and thinking that 0.05 is the magic number laid down from on high, then the ASA statement lays out some reasonably concrete things to do. If you're already sort of past that, then I think that that's what we're going to try to do when we gather people together this October, is to see if we can at very least pull together what are the sort of that overall set of best practices at this point for alternatives, so that as people do the work that these folks are doing, they have more than one method that they can bring to bear to solve problems.
I would go back to transparency too. I mean, one of the things that's clear in the statement and all the conversation around it is the idea that the p-value is not just how it was calculated, but everything that went into it. And I think the more the research community is being very transparent and very thorough in all of the reports about everything that goes into it, the better. I think having all of that information out there, I think we should be requiring analysis plans and really looking much more closely at reports of findings to make sure all of that information is clear and transparent.
Maybe I'll say one more thing in response to your question. I saw a study not that long ago, had to do with sleep research and things that can affect young people's ability to get enough sleep and so on. And there were lots of really interesting things in the study that were written down because they were actually very transparent in this, but were largely ignored by the researchers because they didn't have a statistically significant effect associated with them, even though they were really actually kind of interesting and had somewhat, large effect size. And the focus of the paper ended up being on the things that did have a statistically significant effect, most of which were frankly not all that useful or interesting. And so it just seemed like the idea that you focus on that as your filter turns research on its head and makes people look at, or distracts people to look at the wrong things.
Well, and I think part of that goes too as part of doing a research design and analysis plan up front is pre-specifying your primary outcomes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But I had one very concrete idea for something you could do today to improve practices. And it's very simple. Stop using stars. Right? Your tables, stop. There's not 1 star, 2 star, 3 star findings. Yeah, it's on a continuum. Just stop doing it.
Yeah, it's amazing when you have one piece of paper to give a policymaker and you put the table there. When you bold and highlight and star the significant effects, that's what they look at, So I definitely agree with you.
Yeah. I think that's right. In our own work and reviewing the work of others in the clearinghouses, to try to, and maybe can't stop completely, but at least reduce the frequency of some of the kinds of misinterpretations and misuses that we've been talking about. And in fact, there was a supplementary article to the ASA statement by Greenland et al. That gives a lot more examples and of the kind of phrases you see in research reports that are just wrong. And but then they have a nice concluding section that no, there's currently no magic bullet, and maybe at the symposium next fall and in the aftermath of that, progress will be made. I don't think that there'll never necessarily ever be a magic bullet, but at least there are things that can be done better. And again, taking a much broader view to assessing the totality of the evidence will be helpful. Maybe one more webinar question.
I'm going to take the. I'm going to merge some of the questions and sort of add on my own here. I think there are a lot of pieces of people's questions here that are asking about sort of the tension, though, between policymakers do want a bright line and policymakers do want one page. And so how do you add that complexity and give them that nuance when they want one page?
I mean, anybody that can answer that, let me know. Networking reception. I think one answer to that is that starting from a paradigm in the frequent statistics where it's totally non-intuitive is not a great start to your brief, right? And so to the extent that we employ new methods like Bayesian that produce fairly intuitive probabilistic statements that may help us get there to not have to spend several sentences explaining what the p-value meant, but just jump into here's the probability, here's all the context that sits around it.
Yep. I mean, another plug for the ASA Symposium next fall is that we're planning sessions that will bring together sort of the producers and users of research and establishing dialogues. And the users, this is what they need to do, and then with some discussion back and forth about there's risk in providing that information. I mean, people really don't want to be wrong, and in some cases it can be very disastrously wrong. So working to understand the needs and be responsive to those, while at the same time being candid about you're asking for something that can't be provided. I think getting more explicit dialogue going will hopefully be a fruitful exercise. Are we on time? One last question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Nancy McCall of Mathematica. First, Alan, I want to thank you for not having a poll asking how many of us have ever committed a p-value interpretation transgression in our previous writings. This question is for Ron. Does the ASA have any plans for taking on the misinterpretation of the confidence interval?
No.
So we don't, although I don't know that we shouldn't. I mean, it's not. It's really just the cousin, right, of the misinterpretations of the p-value.
Yeah, it's discussed in the Greenland et al. Article. They have a section on p-values, a section on confidence intervals, a section on power. So it's pretty comprehensive and really a nice article. So, all right. Well, thank you, Ron, Molly, Stuart, Tim. Back to you.
Thank you, everyone here in the DC office and in the webinar audience. We hope you really enjoyed today's talk. If we were unable to get to your question, for those of you who are here in DC, please do join us in the reception area where you can approach the panelists with your questions. And for those of you on the webinar audience, if you'd like to email us, we can forward your questions. Finally, I'd like to ask that all of you, webinar and in-person attendees, please let us know how you think we did by filling out our electronic survey, which is available right now to webinar participants and which will be emailed to all of you here in the room. So thank you again very much. We hope you enjoyed the forum.